events are coming up. Today I'm really pleased to introduce Ivonne del Valle, who is a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at Berkeley. She received her PhD in Hispanic languages and literature from here as well. And she's going to be speaking on a theme that relates to her forthcoming book, Pantitlan, Technology and Knowledge About Water in the Formation of a Colonial State. And that book is forthcoming. So, Ivonne.
Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks especially to College and Mary for organizing this and for inviting me to share my work with you. That is one thing. And the book is not forthcoming. I'm still working slowly on it. It will be forthcoming at one point, but not just now.
In the larger sense.
But before I start to read what I prepared for today, I'd like to say a few words to frame it. I'm working on the drainage of the lakes in Mexico City, which is a process that began in the 17th century, and that one might say that it's still ongoing until now. And what I want to do with that is I want to see how two very different approaches to dealing with water ensued in this region over time. And by this I am referring to something that was said by one of the first anthropologists who worked on this topic in the 1970s. And he said that whereas the indigenous populations had to strive for a system of water management, managing the water of the lakes and the rivers surrounding the area, the Spaniards from very early on had done the opposite, strive for expulsing. It's a model of expulsion. So, and even though this is an oversimplification, because within each system there were times in which it seemed like things could go otherwise, and there's tensions within each system, it is still, I think, a very accurate model. So I'm using that to see how these two models came about, how they happened to even exist, and I'm looking at several things that might help us explain it. One of them is religion. That is to say, what is in the polytheistic religion of the Nahuas and what's then in Christianity that makes a certain treatment of the environment logical or even necessary. I'm also looking at economy, which might not be as evident, or it's not as evident for me, or it was not. No, but because we all know that every religion, in a way, entails a certain relationship between human beings and the environment, but not so much with the economy. But I'm looking at what a tributary imperial system, that was what the Mexicas had, how that engaged water, and how that changed later on with the beginning of mercantilism or capitalism, if we want, with the arrival of the Spaniards. Another area that I'm looking at is technology, but technology not in the very technical aspects of it, but more as a process that, technology is a series of mechanisms that are arrived at after an epistemological process, a scientific process. Now here's a problem, the circumstances, how do we go about resolving it? So that's one area. And the other area of technology, it is that because it has the capacity to change or shape the environment so dramatically. It is always, for me at the same time, when this happens, and with the drainage project, this is what happened. It is always a way of also intervening in certain populations. So I'm looking at technology also in its relationship to politics. And the last area is knowledge. And that's what I'm going to be reading about today, knowledge. And this is not in any very polished form, but it's just like a mapping of a possible approach to how to go about that topic of knowledge in relationship to water. Okay. So in this paper, I want to consider one effect of colonialism, the putting into contact and later distribution and administration of forms of knowledge of diverse genealogy and morphology. In the case of the conquest of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, indigenous knowledge on the one hand, and Spanish, or from then on, Western knowledge on the other. I am specifically interested in knowledge related to the management of the water that surrounded the island of Tenochtitlan and its transformation and spaces of enunciation and practice, along with the persistence of certain paradigms to address water problems. Tenochtitlan was founded in the lowest depression of a large basin without natural exit points through which the excess water that falls during the rainy season and flows down from the surrounding mountains can drain away. Because of the region's geographic and climatic features, the effective management of the water was and continues to be vital for the city's very existence. The epistemological consequences of colonialism have been addressed in various ways since the 1950s. It was at this time that when Edmundo O'Gorman suggested that America was never discovered, that is to say, understood and explained, but had emerged on the stage of universal history as a European invention. Frantz Fanon asserted that the creation of new forms of knowledge disconnected both from what he called the Greco-Roman pedestal and from traditional intellectuals was indispensable to decolonization. Some years later, Dipesh Chakrabarty maintained, on the contrary, that this body of knowledge was indispensable, though insufficient for an understanding of the historical processes occurring in places once colonized. Chakrabarty recognizes, however, that at least in the case of South Asian studies, those who undertake them rarely have the required training, that is, familiarity with the languages and with the intellectual traditions developed in them, to formulate from the knowledge of subaltern groups concepts for critical thought. This would require, rather than the radical rupture Fanon contemplated, establishing an uneven dialogue between those areas of knowledge with different genealogies once the gaps in the researcher's training were somehow bridged. For Chakrabarty, these gaps refer specifically to languages and areas of knowledge rendered irrelevant by a process of colonization and are not in this sense universal, but products of a particular historical relationship. This position diverges from that of Gayatri Spivak, who in one of her analyses of the work of the Subaltern Studies Collective contrasts the historical Hegel who presupposes a progressive diminution of alienation with the Hegel of logic, for whom alienation is a necessary condition for any act of consciousness. In this sense, what Spivak calls cognitive failures would be irreducible, independent of the subject of enunciation and the circumstances. If Spivak intends this clarification as a way of pointing out the desirability of a subject of knowledge that does not render its subject transparent, and this point is well taken, her correction implies at the same time a generalization that does not seem to encompass the contingencies of history. Taking into account these distinct perspectives regarding knowledge in a colonial setting, I will discuss the situation of Indian knowledge on water and the way in which it could be and can be articulated in different projects. The body of knowledge developed during the pre-Hispanic era to manage water and the issues related to it, agricultural cycles, for example, entail a combination of religious practices and technical skills that constituted a way not only to respond to and manage variations in water levels, but also to relate meaningfully to a specific geography. Under this paradigm, the water of the lakes was central to the life of the indigenous peoples of the basin of Mexico. The conquest meant a complete break from this model, first because of the destruction of the city, and later because of the general neglect of the Mexica hydraulic system. Beginning with this rupture, colonial texts reflect several tendencies regarding the integration or lack thereof of Indian knowledge on the waters of the basin. I will not delve into all of them, but I would like to mention a few. One of these is the exclusionary paradigms of the university, whose members, whenever they wrote about water, even well into the 18th century, based their observations on Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Pliny. In addition to the Spaniards' general distrust of the lakes, after all, they had been a decisive factor in their initial defeat by the Mexicas in 1520, they held a negative view of stagnant waters. For Hippocrates in particular, the water of lakes and lagoons, like those that surrounded Mexico City, occupied the lowest point on the hierarchical scale of waters. In his view,
lakes were formed by waters that were bilious, phlegmatic, hot and stinking in summer, turbid and cold in winter. Besides, they were directly responsible for numerous illnesses such as hoarseness, obstruction of the spleen, dysentery, phthisis, edema, pneumonia, tumors, hernias. This viewpoint is represented in works such as México en 1554 by Cervantes de Salazar, in which indigenous hydraulic complex is naturalized as landscape, while the knowledge required to speak of water is displaced to Greek and medieval thinkers without the slightest gesture of reaching for the possible existence of a similar body of knowledge among the Indians. From this perspective, Indian knowledge did not exist, and the lakes, rather than constituting the reason for the city's existence, were mere unpleasant markers of its boundaries. Outside of this context, although from another important institution linked to the state, the research projects undertaken by priests such as Torquemada, Motolinia, and Sahagún inscribe knowledge about water within an anthropological perspective, which in many instances, especially in Sahagún's case, attempted to understand the indigenous systems on their own terms. These texts, as we know, aim to preserve a memory of the past, while at the same time disassociating the rites and customs they presented from contemporary practices. These texts are the main sources of knowledge on Tlaloc, the water deity in whose complex and varied representations, festivals, and rituals, knowledge about water and the means to manage it were articulated. Related to this corpus is that produced by Indians and mestizos who had been educated in religious institutions, but whose goals were, if not in opposition to those of the friars, in an ambiguous relationship to them. Through their writings, Chimalpain and Tezosomoc, for example, strive to preserve rather than eradicate an indigenous memory, even when this memory remained in many ways disarticulated from the new ways of life. Due to the changing living conditions and the neglect of the hydraulic system, the colonial cities suffered constant floods from very early on. At times of emergency, the city government requested ideas from its citizens on how to resolve the flooding, and it especially sought the Indians' help to grasp how they had managed the aquatic environment. Finally, in 1607, after a severe flood, the authorities opted for drainage, that is, for removing as much water as possible from the basin. For various reasons, such as their economic resources and resident skills, the convents were centers of knowledge that could come to the city's assistance when needed. In fact, for most of the 17th century, Jesuits, Franciscans, and Carmelites were in charge of the public works related to water management. Even though they were also the groups most intimately in contact with Indian knowledge, except for on rare occasions, and I will talk about one of them in a bit, the priests and friars in the roles as technicians and engineers in charge of the hydraulic works did not refer to the existence of an Indian base of knowledge on the water. In fact, they committed themselves to the drainage plan, a system contrary to the pre-Hispanic one, which their convents jealously preserve in chronicles and ethnographic accounts. In addition to the ways in which drainage would dramatically change the region, this decision is relevant here because Enrico Martinez, its principal promoter, presents it as a product of discerning between genuine knowledge on the one hand and inadequate or picturesque technical skills on the other. In his dispute with Adrian Booth, an expert brought to Mexico City from Europe to help solve the flooding problems, Martinez asserted that drainage had to be the best option, considering that Booth's proposal consisted of reviving the measures the Indians had carried out for centuries. Thus, implicit in the drainage plan is the notion that in order to have any chance of achieving real results, the knowledge employed must be something other than indigenous technique. The second question related to the drainage of the lakes that interests me is its being, indirectly, the product of the impasse between work, history, and technology. If the Indians constituted the vast labor force needed for the drainage project's massive construction work, and if, as it appears, they actively participated in the missionaries' project of historical compilation, there is, by contrast, a gap between the colonial authorities' request for help in times of crisis and the knowledge produced by the Indians in response. Due to this absence and to the repeated flooding, a new body of knowledge emerged in the form of historical technological archives put together by the city's government in 1637 and 1748. And this continues after the independence with another compilation during the Porfiriato and another one in the 1970s. So in these archives, which attempted to respond to the question of how such an environment could be managed. In them, an interesting phenomena takes place. If flooding allowed for an erasure of the violence of the conquest, because the documents simply referred to the city in its antiquity as if it had been one and the same from pre-Hispanic times to the present, the archives reinscribed this break in the form of an absence. The Indians' technical knowledge for responding to the contingencies of the environment is supplanted in the archives created ad hoc to serve as a memory of the problems, of the proposals designed to resolve them, the discarded plans, the results, cost, etc. But there, the requested Indian techniques take the form of an almost mythological evocation, Pantitlan. The name metaphor of a technical religious knowledge transformed into pure magic, the final solution, which practically without the Indians' intercession would bring an end to the flooding. In the historical record created by friars and indigenous chroniclers, Pantitlan, a natural drain or sinkhole in the middle of Lake Texcoco, is one of the sacred places where during the first and 6 months of the Mexica ritual calendar, human sacrifices to the water deities took place. To Pantitlan were brought offerings of jewels and precious stones, as well as children, and the hearts of victims representing Tlaloc. Tezosomoc, one of these chroniclers, mentions how the sucking power of this drain was such that more than once, when it was considered detrimental to the maintenance of the water equilibrium in the lake region, when fearing a drought, for example, the Mexica lords had determined to stake it off. Nevertheless, by the beginning of the 17th century, there seems to be no trace left of Pantitlan. In its place, there appears in the technical archives produced in 1637 and 1748, the rumor of its existence and the urgency to find it as a solution to the inundations and a way to avert the huge investments of money and labor in the construction of a drainage system. This rumor is linked to Francisco Calderón, a Jesuit whose determination to find Pantitlan convinces the viceroy to fund search parties charged with locating it. I do not know what happened to the efforts organized by Calderón, but if the irony expressed at the end of the 17th century by Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, one of the leading intellectual figures of New Spain, is an indication of their luck, we might conclude it was all in vain. Writing in 1692, after another rainy season that had threatened yet more flooding, Sigüenza y Góngora pokes fun at the people who were still thinking about Pantitlan. One of the search expeditions, he says, had returned after having found not a drain but a fountain, a fact that would be a laughable matter were it not, he adds, that affairs of the utmost seriousness depended on it, which gave the incident a tragic turn. I would like to conclude this brief recollection of how Pantitlan appears in drainage-related planning documents with what was said in 1748 by a member of the city government. In case Pantitlan did exist, he pointed out, it would be in, and this is a quote, it would be in name only because the slime of more than 2 centuries would have clogged the drain and it would not be possible to find it nor to make it function. End of the quote. This assessment presents a crude, though probably accurate evaluation of the effects of more than 200 years of colonization. In any case, it serves as a double metaphor which accepts the possible existence of an alternative way to proceed with the water at the same time that it recognizes the impossibility of integrating indigenous techniques, even in this form, Pantitlan, in which technical knowledge is no more than the name of a fantasy that would free the city from incurring the exorbitant costs required to remove the water from its environs. Even though this is not the point of my paper today, I want to suggest that, at least in reference to the documents about Mexico City, this air of having finally triumphed, not in the form of a supposed Baroque synthesis, but instead in the recognition of the indigenous world as an abated and impenetrable reminder, permeates much of the production of the 18th century that neither finds nor presents any contemporary image which adequately reflects the magnitude of the events and history of the 16th century. Although in their practical uses, the corpuses I have delineated clearly have points of contact, I am interested in tracing the differences among them because these forms of approaching indigenous knowledge about the water have been gradually transformed in unexpected ways. Part of what I am after in this research project is to outline the course of these archives on water. Pantitlan was never found, and drainage has been the approach used in 1607. One can say that the Gran Canal, inaugurated in 1900 during the Porfiriato, when it was announced that the drainage system was finally completed, is by another milestone in a continuum that persists up through today, with the construction of the deep drainage system, el drenaje profundo, built in the 1970s, and with the Canal Emisor de Oriente, the eastern collector, which will be inaugurated in 2012, with the renewed promise that this one will end the threat of large-scale flooding once and for all. These projects can be seen as a series of attempts to domesticate something that resists being tamed, and thus also as an invitation to contemplate, beyond the irony it entails, what has become, since the colonial era, the necessary periodic expansion of the gigantic monster below the city's subsoil, without which the city would not be viable, but because of which the problems and threats multiply, such as the possible rupture of one of these enormous subterranean pipes, the sinking of the city, and the vulnerability of soils depleted of water to seismic activity. I don't think it is a coincidence that historical and ethnographic studies on indigenous water knowledge have been revived precisely during the construction of new drainage works, especially since the 1970s. In a dramatic reversal, in recent years, the work of the university has been to safeguard practices and know-how about to be dismantled by the modern technology of the state. Owing to this effort, Indian knowledge on water is currently being revitalized in at least two spaces. The first, as I already said, is the work undertaken by anthropologists and historians interested in preserving forms of knowledge apparently in danger of being lost. There is also the series of projects by architects, urban planners, and scientists, and they're all also related to the university, or one of the universities in Mexico City. So their work in one way or another, and making reference to the religious and indigenous archive of the 16th century, propose a return to the city of lakes, in other words, to overturn the drainage paradigm, either by reflooding the desolate region of the ex-Lake Texcoco, or by liberating rivers that have been channeled into the drainage system. Nevertheless, one must ask, in what way can the university articulate, and not simply archive, the knowledge of those who practice the now minor knowledge, who in villages and towns at the foot of the volcanoes in central Mexico continue interpolating on another scale and with objectives distinct from those of the pre-Hispanic sorcerers, the gods of water? Another question is whether this preserving is even possible in the face of a technological system that is in opposition to it. To conclude, let me return to the recognition in the 18th century of the accumulation of slime over Pantitlan that had undermined a practice to the point it had become distorted beyond recognition after having been subjugated for many years. Certainly, as I have said earlier, much has changed. What remains is the problem of what can be done now with knowledge produced to manage the water of an area that at the moment of conquest had at most 2 million inhabitants, and which now, and to a great degree thanks to the expulsion of the water achieved at the beginning of the 20th century, has nearly 22 millions. In what sense can this knowledge not be condemned by a simple question of magnitude and all that implies to being but an interesting piece of information in the accumulation of historical knowledge, or a quaint reminder of a time that is evoked for tourists in Xochimilco, but no longer a coherent or organic possibility? And yet it seems to me that its existence must continue to be proposed as a counterpoint to a developmentalist technology that appears to lack the capacity of self-reflection regarding its implications. If Fanon's radical proposal of a fresh new start does not seem viable, the idea that this counterpoint should be found in a specific space and time might seem stubborn or absurd, or both, especially from a point of view that seeks options more attuned to our time's dynamics. Nevertheless, and taking into account the Spivak's warning about self-complacent forms of knowledge, it seems to me that, as Chakravarti suggests, we ought to insist on the historical and contingent character of the relationships I have presented here. This exercise is indispensable for various reasons, and I will conclude with one of them. The need to return to a moment when a decision was possible, when it would have been feasible to choose A, B, or C, in order to be able to understand what was at stake in the philosophical or ideological posture that underlay each one of these options. Thank you. Yeah.
Would you like to take some questions?
Yes,
or
of
comments?
course.
Great.
Very interesting presentation. You suggested at the end that the revival of interest in indigenous knowledge systems relating to drainage and water is largely located in the academy, at least sections of the academy. You're talking about anthropologists, sociologists, town planners, and so
Well,
on.
there's also some urban planners and architects that are involved.
Okay. But these are essentially a sort of technocratic academic elite. So my question has to do with what do we know, if anything, about the intervention in recent years of indigenous communities themselves? So there still are some on the outskirts of Mexico City.
Yeah. Well, the
Contemporary indigenous.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, we know in Xochimilco there's still a few people who keep practicing the same type of agriculture system that was practiced since pre-Hispanic times, more or less. But other than that, I mean, I know that also on the volcanoes, there's still what they call graniceros, no? The people who read the water, no? They read the rain, and they try to manage climatic factors related to rain. But that is, in a way, what I'm also trying to say by pointing out that there's been different moments in which they're trying to get rid of certain practices, but they're always there, no matter what. Know that what the friars were doing in the 16th century, trying to end with these practices, and what the anthropologists are doing in the 1970s, trying to go running to these indigenous communities, which are where life is about to change because of the drainage project, a new drainage project, and yet there's always a reminder. No?
So you're suggesting there are hidden transcripts, to use another kind of terminology here. Alternative, subaltern.
Yes, there are, but always being threatened. No, and now how much water is left, and the water that is left in the region it's not clean. Apparently there were 45 rivers around the area in Mexico, and only one, I think, it's what they call a live river. They all have been channelized. Okay.
I think it's connected to the previous comment or question, and to what extent, I would like to hear in your presentation an expression of self-awareness in terms of to what extent do you see what you're talking about, what you're expressing, as simply a discussion within the context of academia, within the context of planning, within the context, and that would be, I guess, a comment on, or a self-reflective comment on the role of rationality and rational approaches to all these things that are happening. To what extent are they, do you feel that there is an impact of this rational discussion about it when much of what's happening actually in place is driven by all kinds of other forces? I mean, you point them out. You point out simply the sheer amount of people, the sheer amount of heavy metals being put into the water, everything that's happening there. And I would like to hear, maybe if you would want to comment about what is the current discussion in Mexico City about the sources of water from the base of the volcanoes. There is a lake that is being, there's a big political fight trying to make that into a living source of water for the people in Chalco, that area. And I just don't know if you have any comment about it from your perspective.
No, I mean, so you're asking me two things,
Yeah.
right? One is the self-awareness that I'm still within a very rational academic that might not be related to, let me see if I understood your question. Yes, I know that the criticism that has ensued against the drainage project that has been going on since the 1970s, very strong from several members, and mostly all of them from the university setting, that what they say, according to the engineers in charge of the drainage system, makes no sense. No, it's purely, for example, there's this project in which a series of architects are asking for the reflooding of the area of Lake Texcoco, that it's empty and nothing can be done there. But if you talk to an engineer, he would say you cannot leave things to nature, no? And that's what one of them told me, that it's impossible to do something like that because now Lake Texcoco, it's at this level, and Mexico City, it's at this level. So that would mean having a flooding problem, a flooding threat right there, and it makes no sense from their perspective. But at the same time, I think, for example, in the 19th century, it's very interesting to see this group of scientific men, all of them going to the lakes, and some of them saying, these are lakes, and some of them saying, no, these are swamps. No, and they're all scientists. They all have more or less the same training. But even something that seems so clear and obvious, it's a matter of disagreement. It's a matter of interpretation. And with that interpretation, along come a lot of different ramifications, no? And so, in that sense, yes, I know that it's very easy for me to formulate a critic approach to this, but I'm not there working as the engineers are trying to save the city every summer when there's flooding. But that's also, I guess, part of and I was pointing it out, I try to point that out, the irony that now this monstrous work, it's necessary. Without this, the city would not be possible. No, it would not be possible. Because one engineer told me that in a normal rainy season, the city could be flooded up to 5 meters, no, in several areas, and not in clean water, as it was during the colonial period, but in drainage water, as it happened in February with one of these systems stopped working, and a whole area around Chalco, el Canal de la Compañía, and people were flooded in dirty water, and so no, they of course want to save the city, but this is what I'm in a way saying, that we have inherited a colonial project that we have to keep producing and expanding, but never really stopping to think what it means. And it might be impossible to reverse it. It might be impossible. But I think that the exercise of thinking what other options were possible and why, it's a worthwhile exercise. Mm-hmm. And your second question about Chalco, I was not aware of that.
Yeah,
I'm
I
not.
don't know if you-
No, I'm not. I'm not aware of that. I know that there's this urbanist, Jorge Legorreta, who's arguing for. He wants to reopen all the rivers that have been channelized and set them free. But again, the engineers in charge of this, they say there's no money that would pay for that. Where do we go for that? It's impossible. So, very conflicting perspectives on the same issue.
I imagine the flow of water and the flow of cars are in direct conflict with each other. It would be interesting.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I think that it's not so frequent to see works using post-colonial theory looking at the empire, Spanish empire, so I'm glad that you're working on this. So my question is, I see that you are being using post-colonial theory, but you haven't used science studies, post-colonial science studies, and I think that some of the work done by Helen Duran and other people, that they use this new idea of knowledge as assemblage, which is a French word, is more thicker and use more the idea that knowledge is contextual and it's not only about theories or techniques, but more about practices and other things. So that can be interesting for your own work. So my question for you is how you see, because what I'm seeing that you are doing is something that interests me as well, is putting into conversation knowledge that they are not considered like modern knowledge with the modernity. So you are doing this, bridging this gap between non-modern and modern. So my question is for you, how do you see your own position in doing that? How do you think that being academic, you can help to put this in conversation that probably entails putting into practice our theoretical work?
I don't know if I would say, yeah, I think I mentioned the word modern, but at the same time, within, as I said, within which each paradigm, there are moments of tension or like each paradigm has its own criticism. When Enrico Martinez, who was one of the main proponents, says this is what we have to do, which is completely opposite to what the indigenous people were doing, Adrian Booth, who was another European, says no. They bring Adrian Booth to look at the practices, to look at the drainage, and he says, I don't understand this work, I don't know what this is all about, I don't know why you're doing this. What you should be doing is working again on the dikes, the canals, the indigenous system. So is he being not modern? I don't know. No, so I don't know if it's about modern or not modern, because at the same time as Barry Carr asked me about what are indigenous people doing nowadays, they're still doing some things, and are those practices not modern? I mean, they're just different. But yeah, I think that I would be happy to hear, to talk to you afterwards so that you can recommend some of the works that you're talking about. Yes, but I'm thinking about knowledge and the production of knowledge. So what happens when a group of people arrive at a certain place that it's completely new for them, and they want to have things their way, that is to say, work within a region with Pliny and Hippocrates and Aristotle. And what does that have to do with a place in which a population has lived there for many years? And I would imagine that they know their surroundings and they know how they work in seasons and all that. So that yes, the knowledge is it's related to a certain place, a certain area, and all its characteristics, without that becoming also an imposition, no? Because it would be really constraining to think that knowledge, that nature makes us go into just one particular form of knowledge and there's no other way. That could be also very fundamentalist, no? In a way. Mm-hmm.
But that is what it is, scientific knowledge.
Uh-huh.
The idea of modernity in terms of scientific knowledge is like you are saying. is a universalistic.
Exactly, and I think that in some areas, like in this case, it could not be universalistic because there are no regions in Spain that resemble the lake region in Mexico. So they did not know how to deal with that area, and they were not interested in getting to know it. It seems to me they were more interested in making it into what they wanted. Mm-hmm.
Yes, just a couple of comments here. I'm not completely convinced by this contrast between pre-Hispanic and post-conquest period, because in some ways, even though they'd not been there very long, the people of the valley, Mexica and their neighbors, did develop engineering skills, the dike, and the canal from Chapultepec, the aqueduct.
Mm-hmm.
There were several water management efforts made there. Now, I'm sure there were floods that they couldn't handle, and floods that probably caused severe damage to Tenochtitlan and other low-lying cities. And in that respect, Martinez had the only solution. I mean, the Tenochtitlan
Mm-hmm.
was the only way to go, and it's not a surprise that this is the method that's still being used today by modern-day engineers. It's just that the Mexica didn't have the technology and workforce to be able to carry out those major, large-scale engineering projects.
Roger, would you say what the Tenochtitlan was?
That's the cut on the northern side of the basin that
That's-
Martinez.
Yeah, that's the
proposed
first
and
drainage
started.
system.
It's basically getting the water out.
Yes, getting the water out to Hidalgo, the north, and it's still functioning.
Yeah, no, obviously, I am not saying that the Mexica survived there and they didn't change the environment. No, they were managing it, which implies changing it dramatically. Like, for example, the fact that they divided Lake Texcoco at one point, and that created, because Lake Texcoco it's salty water, but because they divided it, in fact, to avoid flooding, that created areas of fresh water closer to the city, and they created another huge dike surrounding the city on the eastern side. So yes, they were managing, they were dealing with the problems of flooding. And there were a couple of serious floods in the pre-Hispanic period, one of them in 1499, which was the most severe one, but that was not due to a mismanagement of the water system in times of during the rainy season. It was man-created because one of the Tlatoanis wanted more water for the city, and he brought more water even though he was advised not to do it. But he went ahead and he brought water from Churubusco, and the city flooded immediately, and a lot of people died. So yes, they had problems of their own. But I don't think it is a matter of them not having the right technology to do that, because I think that building a dike that it's, I don't know how many kilometers long, it's quite an impressive part of engineering with the technology that they had available at the time. And if we're going to say that Enrico Martinez came with the right solution in 1607 to rid the city of flooding, well, there were constant flooding even with that. You know, in 1629 was the worst flooding, in which the city was underwater for 5 years.
Well, it took
So-
300 years for them to really finish it off with the English.
Oh, there's still constant flooding during the rainy seasons in parts of Mexico, especially in the eastern and southern part. Every rainy season, the city floods. So I don't know. Mm-hmm.
I'm having a very hard time visualizing this because I don't know the geography of the area. But
Yeah, I should have brought him. Mm-hmm.
The drain that you speak of, this was a natural drain? I mean, it sounds like it would be a drain in a sink, stabilizing the level of the lake.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know. I'm not really good with the real technical details, but the area of Mexico, the basin, it's surrounded by mountains. No, here is the Sierra Nevada, and here's el Ajusco, and here it is the Sierra de las Cruces. So it's surrounded by mountains, and Mexico City was built, or Tenochtitlan, at the lowest part of the basin, and it was surrounded by 5 lakes, 2 of them here, and the Texcoco, and then so este es Supango, San Cristobal, Texcoco, Xochimilco, and Chalco. And all of them were at a higher altitude than the city itself, so it is a very unlikely place to build a city, but still they did. So what the first at the Tajo de Nochistongo that he talked about was getting the water out of here and also diverting the water of one of the most important rivers, Cuautitlan, so they took the water out. And with that, they thought that they were going to diminish the amount of water coming down to this area. And the rest of the drainage systems have done different things. They come to here, and there's like that. And all of them, they have to go to the north because that's the only area which is not so heavily surrounded by mountains.
But this drain that the pre-colonial people relied upon, this stabilized the lake around the city.
Oh yeah, they did not drain the water. They never drained the water in pre-Hispanic times. No, what they built was dikes and canals. So they had a very complex system. I mean, the city was half in water, half in land. And they had a complex system to with gates, canals, and dikes to, in a way, to decide how much water was going to go inside the city and how much water needed to go outside of the city, And some of the dikes that they built were quite high. But they were dismantled after the conquest because since if it's not the rainy season, it doesn't seem like there's any threat. It's only when it starts to rain, and the rain, it's very heavy. But they start dismantling to build a colonial city. So they dismantled the huge dike, the 2 dikes that were surrounding the city.
Was your question about Pantitlan, though, the mythical?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think that was the question. It was about
Pantitlan. The drain. I don't think it was used as a drain. It was used as a sacred place. What they said that they put there, it's not, they did not use, I haven't found any indication that it was used as a way to let water go. The opposite. It was used, the only things that I found is that they were closing it in order for the water not to go. But it was more like a sacred space. It was before the rainy season and after the rainy seasons, there were all these rituals, and that was one of the main places in which they would go. But no, I haven't, so in the way that in which all religion, or all their technology was religious, yes, it was part of their technological apparatus, but I don't see it being used for water itself. It was used as a part of for sacrifices.
I can think of a somewhat analogous situation because I've studied Venice, and there was an enormous body of knowledge built up on the hydrology of the Venetian lagoon up until 1797. There was a very strong administrator of water up until Napoleon ended Venice's independence. And at that point, everything started going wrong. Again, I think it's an irremediable situation at this point. But there was a huge amount of knowledge at that time.
Yeah, about in.
Are you finding in your research that there are a number of scientists in the colonial period who are in dialogue, who are readers of Malaklu, who are in dialogue about the misuses of the technology? I mean, who are learning lessons
No.
from the written tradition?
No, and that is very interesting because, as I said, it's the paradox that it was at the convents. The convents were the centers where they were archiving that knowledge, but they were not using it. They were not, and it makes sense in a way because it would mean to have the whole the whole indigenous system working again, it would mean sacrifice. No, I mean, how do we separate the only technical practices from the religious practices? So if the friars were in charge of dismantling that in order to bring Christianity, they were not about to revive those technological practices that implies always a religious component.
So that makes perfect sense. On the other hand, right, the indigenous knowledge would have led toward certain very practical ways of resolving hydraulic issues.
No, I don't see any conversations with them. No, and the only way that I found is like this Jesuit Francisco Calderon, the one that I mentioned, who he says that he's heard about Pantitlan from indigenous people, but in that form. That is to say that what Pantitlan had become, like in a way, the oblivion or the forgetting of the technical skills, and just becoming this fetishistic thing, no? That it's there and it's going to help them, but not a series of technical things. No, I haven't found any conversations with indigenous peoples. In 1555, with the first major flood, there's a map, an indigenous map that was produced. And it's very interesting because indigenous people within their maps, they did not tend to picture the whole region. And this is a map of the whole region, the whole lake region, which means to me that it was probably requested by somebody else and it was not of their own initiative to do something like this. But there's nothing in the record that says what type of explanation came with that map or what the indigenous people said. Mm-hmm. Steady.
And I have a question, maybe two questions. Given the what seem like sort of obvious problems with the low elevation of the city vis-a-vis these bodies of water, did the Mexica know this when they chose this city? I mean, what was it, a cost-benefit analysis that the benefits of living near these bodies of water outweighed problems that they would cause? Do we know this? Is there any record of that? And kind of related question, how did they learn their engineering skills? Is there a genealogy of knowledge that we can trace? Did they bring them with them? Did they rely on local, already established populations, or was it trial and error? They figured it out as they went along.
Yeah, no, I don't know if they knew that it would cause a lot of problems, but apparently the city was built there because of a sacred imposition, no? They had to be there because the place where they were coming from was Aztlán, was another island, a place surrounded by water also. So that religious imposition, no? And they, in their peregrination, no. Yeah, their peregrination, their pilgrimage, they're walking from when they left Aztlán, they're supposedly going to places and they're trying to establish themselves in one place or another place. And with Huitzilopochtli, their god says, no, this is not the place for you, this is not the place for you. So when they finally arrive here in a place which it replicates their place of origin, then it's find a place to settle. So one might think that it is like a sacred duty to be there, regardless of the consequences of how irrational it might seem to build a city there, no? And that might be, I mean, we don't know if the idea of Aztlán it's previous to Tenochtitlan or after the fact, no? It might be that they had to create that myth because they ended up in a place like that. We don't know. And they were not the ones the first ones to have all this knowledge about water. It was, I think, especially the people of Chalco and Xochimilco who were the ones who, to me, seem, in the historical record, they seem like the ones who were really good with managing the water because they had been there for longer. And in terms of engineering, the kings of Tlatoanis of Texcoco, they were supposed to be the ones who really knew engineering. I imagine that a lot of the Tlatoanis in the region were schooled or taught these things that they were so vital for living in that area. But in the case of the Mexicas, they seem to be oblivious to that knowledge. And that's what I say again, that in each system there are moments in which the country seems to happen also, because the Mexicans had to rely a lot on the people in the surrounding areas to help them with water management as well, because they were a very militaristic society, and they did not seem to have all of the technology so well developed as the surrounding regions. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if this is related to this, but having lived on and off in Mexico for quite a long time, I mean, I'm just very aware of the fact that in recent times there's been a bit of discussion. I'm not sure whether it's fantasy or what, but there's been discussion about the reopening of the Canal de la Viga, which of course was the last surviving really remnant of pre-contact Mexico, which was only built over, I think, in Mexico, I think in the 1930s, late 20s, early 1930s, as a solution to Mexico's transport problems. So this is
Canal de la Viga.
Right, the Canal de la Viga. It might be worth. It's a curious episode in contemporary Mexico, which does, I think, would be worth exploring simply because it involves a resolution to a very contemporary issue of bottling up of traffic and so on, and real problems in the supply of adequate supply of vegetables and so on to Mexico City. And it involves though a revisiting of a pre-Columbian survival that survived until the 1920s.
Mm-hmm. The city changed dramatically after the 1920s, but up until then, if you see pictures or paintings of the city, there were so many open rivers still, but it was during the Porfiriato, that all of that changed dramatically, and ever since it's been the
expansion. The Canal de Viga survived, I think, until the 30s.
Yes, I think even maybe later. Yeah, I looked into it. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering, I don't know if you covered this before I got here, but where is the water going to be diverted to, and are there populations living there, and what is the area like?
All of the dirty water from Mexico City ends up in Hidalgo, and it's used for agriculture. It is, that's all. But not for hortalizas, at least. That's what they say. But now they're in 2012 with the new drainage, their system, they're going to build also a treatment, a plant for water treatment, that it's supposed to be treating all this water. And I'm sorry, no, not all the water ends up in Hidalgo. Another part of the water ends up in the Mexican Gulf. So they divert the water to this one, to a series of rivers that take the water to the El Golfo de Mexico. Mm-hmm. Roberto.
Thinking about the colonial project, and you made a reference to this effort to erase the indigenous knowledge and kind of struggle with the environment itself via European Spanish knowledge of water. And I'm interested in knowing whether this anxiety and this threat that I think has been the theme throughout kind of our discussion, if that had in any way shaped Spanish notions of their colonial city. I mean, we talk about, Grandeza Mexicana, Balbuena, really tracing this as kind of a pseudo-European city. Is there kind of in other texts a sense of kind of the instability of the city itself, or is there always an effort to kind of erase that threat, that anxiety?
Let's see. Yeah, I think that the water is always there. That to me was what is really surprising. It was surprising when I first started with this project, and I started to see in how many literary texts the water is present. But I think that in the work that Roberto is mentioning, I don't know if you know about it, Grandeza Mexicana, it's a poem written in 1604, and it's a praise to the city as this European city. But I think that even there, the water is seen as something threatening, and in Cervantes de Salazar as well. So it's not always like that. Like for example, no, I guess so. Yeah, it is always a threat. I had not thought about it, but in in Sigüenza-Góngora as well, when he begins his letter about the uprising of 1692, he starts all of the beginning. It's about water problems. And then El Neptuno Alegórico, Sor Juana, it's all about asking the viceroy to become, to solve the water problem. So yes, there's always the element, like the colonial city lived in fear of the next flooding. And it might be that in some cases it's more ambiguous than that, like in Grandeza Mexicana, which the water is threatening, and at the same time, it's part of what makes the city so great, part of its greatness. But it's always, there's always that element of threat, and it has to do, I think, to begin with the way in which they perceive water that was stagnant, that it's not healthy water, because there's also another big area that is the discourse on hygiene and medical discourse, that those waters are not good for health issues. They're not good. So I guess that it's always, even if in an ambiguous form, there's always that element of something threatening there. Mm-hmm.
Ivonne, I think unfortunately we're about out of time for the
Yeah.
formal discussion, so we'd like to thank you.
No, thank you.